Right. Good morning, everyone. We are very happy. This is the last seminar of our Bureau seminar series of this year and this semester. So congratulations, everyone, for finishing the semester and finish, the first semester for the first quarters or two for the year. And so for today's speaker, it's Jake is not stranger to any of you, but I would still would like to give a brief introduction of him. So Dr. Jake Covault is a senior research scientist and co-PI of the Quantitative Clastic Laboratory, QCL, at the Bureau. His expertise is the sedimentology and stratigraphy of deep water depositional systems and source to sink sediment dispersal. Prior to his present position at QCL, Jake was a senior research scientist at Chevron ETC, Energy Technology Company, and served the Department of Interior at the U.S. Geological Survey. Jake received PhD and bachelor degrees in geological and environmental sciences at Stanford University, where he played football from 1999 to 2003, sorry. And Jake has published peer-reviewed research papers and scientific conference abstract pertaining to petroleum geology, reservoir characterization, sedimentology, stratigraphy, basin analysis, earth surface processes, and marine geology. And Jake was the recipient of 2017 SCPM Wilson Award in recognition of excellence in sedimentary geology by a young scientist. So with that, turn the floor to Jake.
Great, thanks a lot. Let me minimize this and get going. So yeah, today, thanks a lot for inviting me to, or not inviting me, I guess. I volunteered to do this. So thanks for allowing me to present to y'all.
We're happy.
And today what I'm going to be chatting about is just like what the title says. I'm going to try to give a really broad overview of the heterogeneity that's inherent to deep water depositional systems, or maybe you can think of it even more broadly, like continental margin depositional systems. And I'm going to focus on a really beautiful subsurface data set, or seismic reflection data set that we've been playing with offshore of New Zealand. So the only people not many people have seen this before, I don't think. I gave it at a USGS seminar like a few months ago. And then we presented it to sponsors last year. So this is kind of new stuff. And I want to acknowledge the QCL, this is really a group effort from interpreting some of the seismic to interpreting some of the processes that are happening, and especially Zoltan, who's a co-PI of the QCL, and Dallas, who's like an indispensable member of the Bureau of Economic Geology. And then just the interaction with our students and other staff like Tim Lawton has been really awesome.
Jake, you haven't shared your screen yet.
Oh, I haven't, okay.
Yeah.
Let me. Bear with me. Here we go. Y'all can see that?
Yes. Yes.
Cool. Okay, so those co-authors are listed here. And then you can see the title. Like, I don't need to read it again, right? I also want to acknowledge the New Zealand government for some of the seafloor topography data that I'm going to be showing you, and then the New Zealand Petroleum and Minerals for an awesome database of subsurface data that is just freely available. You just got to pay for the hard drive to ship it to yourself. And we use Paradigm or Emerson seismic interpretation software to produce some of the imagery that you're going to be seeing today. And then I want to acknowledge our sponsors of the last couple of years who have been funding this research, and you can see them all there. And we retained a lot of them, and then we added a few in 2021, even during a tough time. So we're pretty psyched about that. But here's an outline. First, I'm going to give a real brief overview of deep water heterogeneity and how it's a research focus of our lab. Then I'm going to use this beautiful data set offshore the west coast of the North Island of New Zealand as like a framework for discussing deep water heterogeneity. So the seismic reflection data that you're going to see provides a real broad, large scale view from shelf edge down to basin floor of the distribution of stratigraphy and geomorphology in deep water systems. And it's a good starting point for thinking at the big scale and then zooming into the smaller scale. And specifically, we're going to be addressing questions of how do these canyon channel fan systems change as you go from upstream to downstream. And this data set has some really spectacular examples of mass transport complexes, which are basically the deposits of like submarine landslides. So we're going to talk a little bit about how some of the sandier depositional elements are interacting with the mass transport complexes. Then zoom in, once we have that framework kind of in mind from this beautiful example, then focus in on some of the sand-prone architectural elements, namely channel and lobe deposits, and some of the observations that we can glean from outcrop, like relatively high resolution outcrops, and then all the way up, and then how the observations from the outcrop scale to the seismic reflection data set that I kind of introduced deep water depositional systems with, and the questions that we're after in this kind of multi-scale investigation of deep water heterogeneity from what you see in outcrop to what you see in seismics are what are the sandy building blocks, what are the muddy building blocks of these depositional systems, and then how do you stack them up? That's a stratigrapher's approach to understanding heterogeneity. Right? A little overview about our lab. Just one slide. We focus on clastic depositional systems, their sedimentology and stratigraphy, and we really focus on 2 scales of observation. We have a big source to sink or exploration scale theme. This cartoon in the upper left is trying to illustrate the ideas that we're wrestling with at that scale of observation and investigation. How does sediment come from mountain belts and is transported along a sediment routing pathway to form depositional systems that in some cases are reservoirs, but at a real broad perspective. And then we zoom in to those individual depositional systems to investigate the facies within them and then how they stack and how that facies architecture, so the stacking of those different facies, how that impacts fluid flow during either hydrocarbon production, or we're talking a lot with the Gulf Coast Carbon Center to try to understand how that facies architecture impacts supercritical CO2 migration as well. So that's our research focus. And then Zoltan, Zoltan Sylvester is a co-PI, and he is collaborating with folks around the Jackson School Bureau and all over to develop tools for our sponsors as well that help them, that assist them in subsurface characterization predominantly. So that first part, this is a big R&D focus for us, understanding heterogeneity, not just in deep water systems. I'm talking about deep water because that's what I think I'm an expert in. That's what my expertise is in. And but we work in all environments of deposition, predominantly deep water, fluvial, and shallow marine. But recently we've been looking at aeolian deposits as well. Zoltan has some really cool early results from thinking about the stacking of sedimentary structures at various scales that have implications for aeolian deposits. Anyway, so let's get on the same page about what we mean by heterogeneity. Like, people fly throw the word heterogeneity around all the time. And I like this definition shoot from the first sentence of the abstract of this old SPE paper by our Larry Lake and our Jerry Jensen, right? Like, heterogeneity is the spatial variation of properties, and in particular, in the context of reservoir characterization, we're talking about in the subsurface. So it's just how properties are distributed in the subsurface. And one of the first efforts to sort of better understand different scales of heterogeneity in deep water was developed by these legendary deep water sedimentologists and stratigraphers like Emiliano Moody and Bill Normark and David Piper and Henry Postman-Tier. And they wrote a series of papers together, like from the 80s through to around this paper that I'm highlighting here is from 2001. That just highlighted the different scales of features within deep water systems. And so they're really getting at these features have properties to them. And so they're really starting to get at the multi-scale heterogeneity of deep water. And so there's this famous diagram that deep water people will probably recognize, where you have a horizontal scale and a vertical scale, and then different features that are inherent to submarine fans and related turbidite systems, from like ripples to architectural elements, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then to entire submarine fans, some of the largest piles of sediment in the world. And specifically, these folks, Bill Normark and David Piper, they focused on, and Emiliano Moody and Postman-Tier for that matter, they focused on these sandy architectural elements. There was a lot of work done around the time that this paper that was published in 2001, where folks were focusing on like classifying entire submarine fans and turbidite systems as either muddy or sandy. But like the quintessential like muddy system has sandy architectural elements to it. Like they have sandy channels and sandy lobes. And so they thought that it was maybe more helpful, especially in the context of subsurface characterization, to think about the what those sandy architectural elements, those sandy building blocks are. And you can read the quote below, but basically they had like levee overbank deposits, levee channel or channel fill and depositional lobes. And there's some other ones too, but those are the big ones. So they focused on the architectural elements, but then, you know, they also acknowledge that there's multi-scale heterogeneity inherent to deep water systems. And so this is a series of diagrams that try to illustrate from a stratigrapher, that's me, like stratigrapher's perspective, not a diagenetic expert or reservoir quality expert or anything, a stratigrapher's perspective, a sedimentologist's perspective, the different scales of heterogeneity of deep water systems, from small scale deposits, which are illustrated here, these very generalized grain size profiles are meant to represent the breadth of types of beds, or we call them sedimentation units, that happen in deep water systems. And so these individual sedimentation units were deposited by individual sediment gravity flow events. So sediment gravity flows are mixtures of sand and water that move downhill. So one of those events forms a sedimentation unit, which can form a bed or a couple of beds. And so you have sandier ones called turbidites that many people are probably familiar with. The Bauma sequence that everybody learns in sedimentology and stratigraphy 101 is meant to describe the sequence of sedimentary structures or divisions within an individual turbidite sedimentation unit. And then you have, at the other end of the spectrum, you have really muddy debris flow deposits. And here's labeled as a debrite. And then lately people have been interpreting something between these really muddy debris flow deposits and these really sandy turbidites. And at this scale, a lot of the heterogeneity is within the individual sedimentation unit divisions of those beds. So that's how heterogeneity is affected at that bed scale. But then those beds stack one upon the other to form some of those architectural elements that I mentioned before, that Emiliano Moody and Mormark and all these people like studied, right? So the two like very commonly interpreted sandy architectural elements in deep water are channel fill, which I've illustrated here, and then sheets or lobe architectural elements. And you can see they're really different. They're kind of like the end members of, if you could imagine like the basic sandy building blocks of a system, like these are the end members. You get like sheets that extend forever, and they're like 10 meters thick or something. And then you have these channelized deposits that are much more confined, like to a few hundred meters max, and then they're about the same thickness. So you get these more confined architectural elements, and you get these more sheet-like ones. And so again, the beds stack one upon the other to form those architectural elements. The architectural elements stack one upon the other to form systems, right? Or there's other words for this. Like some people put another level of hierarchy between architectural elements and systems. They call it like a complex, something like that. But generally speaking, all those architectural elements organize themselves in such a way to form entire depositional systems. And really the important heterogeneity at that scale are the flooding surfaces between, or I shouldn't say flooding surfaces, the regionally mappable mudstones that are between the more sandier components of the genetically related fan deposits. So that's kind of deep water hierarchical stratigraphy simplified in a relatively short amount of time. So what are some applications of understanding deep water heterogeneity? Well, like what I was trained, a lot of what I was trained in was in the context of better understanding reservoir architecture, mostly from the standpoint of oil and gas reservoirs, like conventional oil and gas reservoirs. But then I also worked at the USGS and worked on a carbon sequestration national assessment project, and it was the same thing. It's trying to, characterize the subsurface in as much detail as possible. And so here's an example in the context of conventional oil and gas development that was published by ExxonMobil like a number of years ago, where they defined this basic building block, this architectural element that's hundreds of meters wide and then 10 meters or 15 meters thick or so, based on some outcrop observations that they had studied. And then it's composed of beds, sediment gravity flow deposits. And so the beds stack one upon the other to form these channel fill architectural elements. And then they put those are like the individual building blocks, and then they ended up stacking all the building blocks up to make a reservoir model. and then they would vary the properties within the reservoir model. In one case, they had a simple trend of sand to, or an axis to margin trend within the individual channel fill architectural elements it was sandy, and then it was a little bit muddier. Then they put gravel lags that were really highly permeable at the base, usually low porosity, but high permeability at the base of the channels. And then they added some more heterogeneity. They added a little shale drape between the individual architectural elements, and then they put everything together just to evaluate how it impacted flow. And so that's kind of a cool paper, one of the first of its kind that I recommend people that are interested in deep water channelized system heterogeneity and reservoir performance. They might want to check it out in 2008. So we're doing the same type of stuff in our lab. Here is a seafloor map from BOEM of a channel system that one of our graduate students has been interpreting in a lot of detail in the shallow subsurface. And so I can't show the data. I don't have permission to show the data, but I can show the seafloor that I downloaded from BOEM, what that looks like. And so what this student did is Paul Morris. He interpreted those channel elements like the ExxonMobil group did on the basis of their outcrop characterization within this shallow subsurface data set using seismic reflection data. And that's what this map shows here, where the purple lines are the basal or older channelized architectural elements, and the yellow are much younger. And then Paul and Zoltan have been going in to individual bends within this this mapping framework that Paul developed in collaboration with the rest of our lab, like Dallas and me and Zoltan. And they're starting to use the MATLAB reservoir simulation toolkit to do really simple sort of dynamic evaluations of the reservoir with different injector producer scenarios. And this is just one of those scenarios that I'm not going to go into in a lot of detail. Don't want to steal either Zoltan or Paul's thunder, but just this is the type of work that our lab has been doing. There's other applications, like in the context of geohazards, since oil and gas companies started stepping out off of the continental shelf in the Gulf of Mexico and developing in deeper and deeper water. You go from a scenario like this, where you get pretty flat seismic reflection and bedding, pretty straightforward and simple, to as you get closer to the shelf edge and the slope, where the gradients are a little steeper and the shelf edge deltas that are forming in the edge of the continental margin are a lot heavier, you get a lot more complexity. So just compare these two relatively high resolution seismic reflection, shallow subsurface examples from the Gulf of Mexico. Pretty simple, a lot more complicated, from faults to salt diapirs to canyons to landslide scarps. And understanding that distribution in the shallow subsurface is really important for the assessment of geohazards. And we actually have some experience. We actually have a project where we're pursuing another kind of geohazard assessment, thinking about deep water heterogeneity. I kind of cut my teeth as a graduate student at Stanford, working in collaboration with the USGS and Bill Normark, who I mentioned before. And a lot of the work that Bill had done at the USGS was in the marine geology group, but it was focused on earthquake hazard assessments. So the idea is that he and colleagues and graduate students like me and Brian Romans and other people would correlate shallow subsurface layers, which included some of these sandier gravity flow deposits, and then you'd know the relative timing and also date the relative timing of fault offsets for offshore earthquake assessment. And we're doing something similar to that right now with the USGS, looking at Cascadia. The contacts at the USGS are Joan Gomberg and Nora Nomitsky, and then there's other colleagues too, but those are the first two that come to mind that I've been talking with a lot more lately. But there was a USGS professional paper that was published about a decade ago where scientists correlated the ages of the turbidites and said that they were all related. They all correlated, and so they're all related to landslides that were a result of earthquake shaking. So we're kind of reevaluating some of those correlations and the sedimentology and stratigraphy collected from cores across this margin. And so those are like a bunch of applications from the subsurface to the shallow subsurface and geohazards, but we just don't know very much about deep water depositional systems. This was published in the BBC like a few years ago. The giant undersea rivers we know very little about. And the idea is that we don't know much about the gravity flows that are carving out the giant canyon and channel systems and forming the submarine fans that are the largest piles of detritus in the world. So just to better understand our Earth and how continental margins evolve, the canyon channel fan systems in deep water of continental margins is pretty darn important. All right, after all that intro, now I'm going to get into the framework for understanding deepwater heterogeneity with this Taranaki Basin data set. Asking these questions: how do these canyon channel fan systems change downstream? And then what might be the role of mass transport complexes? Very recently on social media, I noticed people throwing around cartoons like the one you see here. This was initially, I've seen this in a lot of places. It's never really, I don't know if it's been published. It's published, it was probably shown at meetings a lot of times, and the ExxonMobil group developed it, where you get what, like a modestly incised gully or canyon form or something, and then it becomes more deeply incised across the upper part of the slope, and then you get sinuous and meandering submarine channels that become less well confined as you move down slope, and then they feed depositional lobes. And so keep this cartoon in mind, which was just cited and got like a lot of traction on LinkedIn. Keep this in mind in the context of some real data that I'm going to be showing you in the next few slides. So, you know, the big question, this is how people think canyon channel fan systems change downstream. Like generally that's right. I think I'll just give you the spoiler alert, but just keep this diagram in mind in the context of the data that I'm actually going to show you. The other question is the interaction with mass transport complexes. We got a lot of good examples in New Zealand. And I think that there's an opportunity, whereas like past studies, like the one I'm highlighting here from the New Star PI, Lorena Moscardelli, have focused most on the like really detailed mapping and exquisite mapping really, and then interpretation of the mass transport complexes themselves, the subaqueous landslides themselves. I think that there might be, and people have been doing that for a while, but there's also opportunity to investigate the depositional elements around and associated with those mass transport complexes. And namely, there's a lot of submarine channel interaction with mass transport complexes that we're going to document in New Zealand. That's just building on the story that Lorena and my predecessor at the QCL really started to tell over a decade ago. So I want to give Lorena a plug. Like, it's awesome that she's here at the BEG again. Welcome. Welcome back, I guess. So returning to this slide of deepwater heterogeneity, there's kind of two scale. You get different perspectives from different types of data, right? So at the outcrop scale, we see beds, and then they stack to form architectural elements. And that's kind of like what we see at the outcrop scale. And we don't see much bigger than that just because outcrops are limited in spatial extent. At the seismic scale, we see, sometimes if we're lucky, we see individual architectural elements. In the example I'm going to show you, we're lucky, okay? And then, but what we generally see is how those architectural elements stack to form entire depositional systems. So in this first part of the talk, as a framework, we're going to be talking about the seismic scale, the large scale. And we're going to go to New Zealand to do that. So here's a map of New Zealand, obviously, and then the seafloor around New Zealand at not super high resolution, but like at the scale of the entire islands, it's pretty amazing. And so this is like 250 meter resolution bathymetry, and you can see a breadth of channelized features that are all, and different widths of the continental shelf that are kind of all around New Zealand. And I don't have time to now, but like it's really fun to go in and zoom in and look at some of these in a lot of detail. There's a lot of variety. There's a lot of tectonic variety, and then there's a lot of variety in the resultant margin architecture. But where we're going to focus is up here in the north, just off to the west of the North Island, in this region here, in a place called the Taranaki Basin. So here's a really generalized map of some of the primary like tectonic elements and sort of basin elements of the margin in New Zealand. You have a convergent margin over here and a beautiful trench, or there's a trench where there's trench fill that is part of the Hikurangi Canyon and Channel system. And then there's a beautiful accretionary wedge, a lot of complexity just west of the trench. But don't worry about that. Don't focus on that. There's just a paper in geology about this channel system that I can't remember the authors, but it was pretty good. So check it out if you have time. The Taranaki Basin is broadly like west of the North Island of New Zealand, and it's kind of like in a back arc location. These little pimple dots here that you see on the topography of New Zealand, those are volcanoes. So here are a number of wells across the Taranaki Basin that mostly focused in these grabens here in this back arc location. Age is in the y-axis, and then sediment accumulation of these 4 wells is in the x-axis. And what you see is that through the Myo, Plio, and into the Pleistocene, there's a big pulse of sediment. And so what happened in the Plio-Pleistocene is that there's thought to be a lot of uplift of the North Island, and then also tilting like into the basin. So that filled up this graben and promoted a heck of a lot of Pleistocene age progradation to where you see the present day shelf edge. So it prograded it out to that shelf edge location. And then, just for a little bit more context, here are some of the primary tectonic events that occurred, since the Miocene, highlighting the Pleistocene tilting, erosion, and tilting, uplift, and then erosion of the onshore that promoted really large sediment supply and progradation to the current location of the basin margin. So we're going to zoom in to a couple of seismic reflection volumes right around here, right at that shelf edge where you see those little canyons in the lower resolution bathymetry. And we're going to zoom down onto it, and I'm going to show you in map view what these seismic reflection data look like. And then this is going to be a pic on the seafloor, showing the transition of the seafloor geomorphology from the shelf edge, more or less, or the uppermost slope, down into the basin floor. And the slopes here are pretty, even though it's like a depositional progradation of the margin by sediment routing processes resulted in the current shelf edge location. The slopes are pretty steep on this, like on the upper part of the slope, it's around 2 degrees. So for continental margins, that's pretty steep, unless you're in a tectonically active setting, which I'll talk about later. Okay, so upstream, you get this kind of canyon and valley network, and you can see a number of these features, and they're V-shaped in cross-section, which I'll show you in a bit. Then as you move downstream, you can see that the channel, like the channelized feature, the canyon channel feature, ends up getting a lot more narrow, and then it also develops a little bit of sinuosity. But there's really weird bends in some of this narrower part of the channel system. Like these bends in particular are really wild. And then there's like a crinkly texture underneath it that you can detect from the seafloor. So basically those bends are related to navigating around blocks on the top of a mass transport complex, which I'll show you in cross-section in a bit. We continue to move downstream, but then at the end, and then we got a little scale change, just FYI. And then as you move onto the flatter part of the basin floor off of the slope, you're away from the mass transport complex, and the sinuosity looks different. It looks a lot more like the way that a river might be naturally sinuous. You see it in this channel system here, and then you see it in this one here, to a point where it again exhibits some strange bends and very straight segments. And again, there's another mass transport complex that you can't see as clearly on the seafloor. You can't see the topography of it on the seafloor because it's buried. But the channel system's kind of weaving its way across this blocky mass transport complex top. So we continue to move downstream. And then you can start to see a rumpled texture. That's a mass transport complex that influences the channel morphology. You see you have this nice sinuosity of this channel system, and then it becomes, it's still sinuous, but it's kind of like picking its way across blocks. And then further downstream, you get a number of low sinuosity, more weakly confined channels. So this isn't nearly as sinuous. It's got a little bit of sinuosity to it, but it's pretty darn straight. You see this one, you see a little remnant of this one, you see these all across the seafloor. And so you get these straighter, more weakly confined channels. So before I go on, I want to kind of stop at that and talk a little bit about some thoughts that we have about lower sinuosity, more weakly confined channels. So what makes a channel sinuous or relatively straight? So we'll focus on what makes channels more straight. So where do you find straight channels? Well, one place you find them is in steep topography. Here's an example offshore of Southern California, where I did a lot of work for my PhD in the California borderland. This is a vertically exaggerated image of the shelf, slope, and basin floor. Like especially around here to the left part of the screen, the gradient on the margin is like 10 degrees. It's very, very steep. So the gravity flows are just, they're stupid. Gravity flows don't want to develop sinuosity. They don't know any better. They're just mixtures of sand and water. They're just going straight down the 10-degree, relatively steep slope, and they form these more straight channels. So that's one way you get straight channels. But we're on the basin floor where we see these more straight channels in the New Zealand example. So the other way that that we think influences the sinuosity that's preserved in channel systems, whether they're more sinuous or more straight, is just based on the maturity of the channel system. So there's a really nice paper in 2002 by Natalie Babineau on the modern Congo or Zaire canyon and channel system. So here's a gradient map of the Congo canyon and channel system. Upstream is here, and then further downstream is to the left. And they say that an interesting transition is from these more sinuous meanders to much straighter channel segments as you go from upstream to downstream. And they think that that's related to the channel maturity. So these sinuous channels are much more mature, and then they're much less mature and straighter because not as many gravity flows reach all the way, which carve the channels. They don't reach, they never reach all, not as many of them reach all the way to the distal part of the submarine fan. And you can read their quote right here. And so they document at these red dot locations, the sinuosity changes from more sinuous to more straight. So we've evaluated this idea of channel maturity. One of the things our lab does, and Zoltan is the, I say our like generously, but Zoltan builds these awesome models that help us evaluate some of the interpretations that we form based on characterization of different data sets. And so this is an example of a model that you can download on GitHub called MeanderPy. And the idea is that it replicates the plan form evolution of channel systems based on a simple, I mean, it's not that simple, like this is me talking ignorantly about it, but it's based on the most important rule is that the migration rate of the channels is a function of the curvature of the channel, and specifically the weighted sum of upstream curvatures. And so it produces sinuous patterns like you see here for a aggradational submarine channel system that look a lot like natural examples of aggradational submarine channel systems. And so the idea is if you run the model for a long time, the channel's relatively mature and it produces this very complex high sinuosity that we commonly see in more proximal locations of submarine fans. For example, here's an example from the relatively sinuous reach of the upper part of the Bengal fan. This is the seafloor on the left. And then in this box region, if you look just below the seafloor, this is what the seismic stratigraphy of the shallow subsurface looks like. I mean, shoot, that looks like a meandering fluvial system. Like a lot of gravity flows moving through this location and meandering the channel, making it very mature over time. So if you don't run the model as long, it's a much more immature type of channel system. So this is the same model more or less than what Zoltan ran for the more meandering, very complex case that looks like the Bengal upper fan. But he just cut it off after a few time steps. And so you get these low sinuosity channels. Like imagine not as many gravity flows moving through this channel to force it to meander, and then it forms these low sinuosity straighter channels. This is like the immature case that we see in the distal reach of submarine fans. This is a map of the seafloor of the distal reach of the Congo submarine fan, really low sinuosity channels. You can see one here, see one here, you can see one here. And when you look at backscatter imagery and interpretations of that imagery, this is what the depositional architecture of the depositional map of the shallow subsurface is thought to look like. All these numbers represent avulsions of these weakly confined channels that feed lobes. And so there's a heck of a lot of jumping around of these channels at this distal reach. And so they just aren't active for long enough to develop the really high sinuosity that we see in more proximal locations. More thoughts on meandering before I move on back to focusing on our data in the New Zealand. I recently gave a talk at a SEDS Online sponsored by IAS presentation, and somebody asked a question in the chat, what initiates meandering and sinuosity anyway? And that's a good question. I get that people ask that question a heck of a lot, and Zoltan's been actually investigating that for a while, and he has some recent social media posts, which I've linked here, or I didn't actually provide a link, but check out his Twitter feed, where he starts a straight channel segment, has an initial perturbation, and then he runs that MeanderPy code over the top of it, and the initial perturbation causes really complex, very realistic looking meandering patterns to form over time. And somebody has a nice comment like, has anyone said that look like hernia? And Zoltan very, stoic, like nobody has said that before. I love that. Okay, so back to New Zealand. And now we're going to zoom into these data and look at them in a little bit more detail. I showed you the map view of the seafloor. Now we're going to look at the shallow seismic stratigraphy and cross section. So upstream, now we're in the most upstream part of the reach of the channel system, and we're going to be moving progressively farther downstream. And I'm going to be stopping along the way to point out some features. Check it out. Upstream, you get more deeply incised V-shaped canyons and channels. And then as you move downstream, you can see they're changing a little bit. You get some levee overbank development on the side of some of these channel systems. And then you can see the relief of the channels is diminishing. They're getting a little bit narrower as well, especially from the levee crest to levee crest. So now they're a lot lower relief. That orange line is the base of mass transport complex. So that relatively chaotic, or that lumpy texture that I showed you in the seafloor map is from that mass transport complex that I highlight here. So that chaotic character in seismic reflection data is mass transport complex character. And then you see the channels are narrowing downstream. You can still see that chaotic character underneath them. It's a mass transport complex. Now we're switching to another volume, which is a better volume. It's higher frequency, or it's not higher. Oh, I don't remember what the frequency content is. There, the frequency content is in the upper left, but just look cleaner data. And then you get these meandering channels and more mass transport complexes further downstream. So we're going to investigate how these channels interact with the mass transport complexes. There's also some really cool stuff at depth, some enormous mass transport complexes. We need to talk to Lorena. She's probably going to map the crud out of those. But notice when one of these little channel features, it interacts with the mass transport complex topography, it kind of like locks in place, and you don't see it moving around. I mean, it moves downstream. That's based on these seismic reflection profiles, but it's not meandering nearly as much. And we saw that in map view too, right? So this is a left-right location of the profile on the previous slide. And then we're looking at the spot where these channels are relatively straight as they kind of weave their way across the mass transport complex topography. And then here is a map just below the seafloor, about 50 meters or so. And again, the channel is relatively straight as soon as it starts to interact with the blocks, and it's just kind of picking its way across the blocks. Okay, so let's keep moving. And now the next channel here, this guy is going to interact with the mass transport complex. And let's see, again, it doesn't look like it's meandering anymore. It's just like that single little channel form. And so we're looking at that previous seismic reflection profile is left right here. And then you see the channel, it goes from really sinuous to the like southwest, and then it becomes, or the bottom left part of the screen. And then it starts to pick its way across the mass transport complex and it becomes really straight. So I think that the mass transport complex topography, all this blocky texture that you're seeing, especially in this map, is really playing a prominent role in how the channel is evolving, right? It's just kind of locked in place in that one spot, and it's just a single concave up seismic reflection. So as you move further downstream, there's a transition. The channels have, passed over the top of this mass transport complex here. These are, submarine landslide deposits. And then you see a number of like high amplitude discontinuous blips. And these are all some of these weakly confined straightish channel forms that I mentioned that we could see sort of hints of on the seafloor map when I showed you the seafloor map. So there are those. And then you also see really continuous seismic reflections, high amplitude seismic reflections. Those are some more sheet-like deposits. Those are probably depositional lobe-like deposits that are being fed by some of these weakly confined channels. So here's an image of that just below the seafloor. The seismic reflection profile is approximately left-right. And then you see, you pass over the mass transport complex and you get a bunch of these kind of variably sinuous, but generally low sinuosity channel forms. That's what those channel forms over here are. So we continue to move downstream. You see more of the same. All right. So let's take a look at this is a semblance attribute, which is like a similarity attribute. So when things are really different, they plot as black. From when seismic reflection traces from one trace to the next are very different, they plot as black. When they're similar, they plot as white. So it helps highlight channels and faults. You have upstream canyon and valley network. Then you get this downstream channel narrowing and shallowing. Remember those irregular bends, and that's because of that underlying mass transport complex topography. And then the channels become a lot more beautifully sinuous, kind of like you might see in a river on the Earth's surface. But they become straighter as they start to interact with the blocks of the underlying mass transport complex. So yeah, meandering channel system over the flat basin floor, unperturbed basin floor, and then you get these weird segments across the mass transport complex. And then as you go over the mass transport complex, there's a transition in the channel architecture where there's a heck of a lot of laterally offset lower sinuosity channels. So I'm going to zoom out. Yeah, I mentioned those straighter, more what we call weakly confined channels at this transition. And now what I'm going to do is move from this is a map of that semblance attribute like right below the seafloor. And then I'm going to move down to the bottom of the stack of these channelized channelized deposits. It's about 200 milliseconds into the subsurface. And then I'm going to come back up just so you can see, you get an idea for the evolution of the morphology of this thing in map view. So moving from seafloor down, and you can read the labels for yourself. And then maybe I'll highlight stuff on the way back up. And this is a pretty sweet look at a mass transport complex, which is again, one of these submarine landslide deposits. So we're moving from the base of the channelized deposits, which is the top of the mass transport complex, which you can see here in this crazy character. Now we're going to move up, and you're going to see how this channel forms first, and then there's a bunch of avulsions. This channel forms second, and then there are a bunch of avulsions, and they kind of, the channels just kind of lose confinement downstream, which is downstream is to the upper left. So moving up. So this channel forms first. You get this nice, really straight channel, and then it probably deposits a lobe with all these concentric shaped bed forms on the distal reach. And then you also have a number of avulsions you can see here, and we count up these avulsions later. Then you get this next channel system come in, same idea. And then there are these channels over here, which are kind of low sinuosity all over, and I haven't looked at in a lot more detail. So let's look at some cross sections, some regional cross sections. Some of these regional cross sections that I'm going to show you, they helped us to generate some of these attribute maps that I think illuminate the character and honor some of the stratigraphy in a lot of detail. So what you're going to be looking at is the different horizons we mapped regionally, base of the mass transport complex, top, base of that first channel system, and then base of the next channel system, and then the top of the next, or an intra-channel system horizon. And again, the reason to map all this stuff in 3D is just to show you that, or just to show you what it kind of looks like stratigraphically. And we're really interested in trying to better understand how the mass transport complex influenced the subsequent channel deposition. So I'll show you what those maps look like now. Maps of those horizons. Seafloor, and then we're going to go down about 200 milliseconds into the subsurface in sequence, not right away. So this is what the seafloor looks like. You can see the last active channel, and then it just kind of dies out. Moving down into the subsurface, there's that last active channel system, but then you see that there are a number of other channels that are emanating from it. So lots of avulsions are happening. We're moving downstream, or down, I'm sorry, not downstream. We're moving down into the subsurface. Here's that first active channel system kind of near the top of it. And then this is the base of that first active channel system, which is also the top of this mass transport complex. I think this map is freaking awesome. And I think we should talk to Lorena about it more, especially because, again, we just kind of mapped the top and the base of the mass transport complex, those subaqueous landslide deposits, and left it at that because we care more about the channel and lobe architectures, but still really neat map, I think. And then, and you can see once it starts interacting with the blocks, it starts to become straight. And then as it transitions across the mass transport complex onto the flat basin floor, get straighter channels feeding lobes, and then numerous other weakly confined channels. So I'm going to move from that. This is the base of the channel deposits. So we'll move back up to the seafloor just so you can see what that looks like again. You can see how everything's stacking and moving over time, right? So that was just a framework for exploring this stuff at a large scale. We documented how the canyon channel systems are changing from upstream to downstream, focusing not just on the seafloor, but also on the shallow subsurface, about 200 milliseconds of two-way travel times worth of seismic stratigraphy, or that's around 200, maybe a little bit less of meters worth of shallow subsurface stratigraphy. Go from deeply incised canyons to these meandering channels to weakly confined channels. And then we also investigated how the channels were interacting with mass transport complex. You know, we got the weird bends. The channels kind of lock in place to weave their way around some of the blocky tops of the landslide deposits or the mass transport complexes. it also results in some weird plan view patterns that aren't predicted for like the types of submarine channels that develop across an unperturbed continental rise. Okay, so now the second part, which is a little bit shorter, it's trying to put some of those big scale observations into context of what we see at the small scale, and asking the question, trying to answer the question, like, what are the sandy building blocks, and then how do they stack? And can we get a better understanding by thinking of small scale to large scale? Here's our, our little plot of the different scales of heterogeneity in deep water systems, from the deposits that stack to form architectural elements to the entire systems, like what I was highlighting in the Taranaki Basin data set. At the outcrop scale, you get smaller scale features. You get deposits for sure, you get beds for sure, and then sometimes you get architectural elements, and then if you're really lucky, you get stacks of architectural elements. I'll show you some examples of those in outcrop, and then at the seismic scale, what you see, because I just showed you a bunch of it. So channel deposits, and here's our little example from seismic. But then zooming in, here is what this basic sandy building block of deep water depositional systems, the channel fill architectural element, what it looks like in outcrop. This is a photograph from the Tres Pasos Formation in southern Chile that I worked on a bit with Steve Hubbard and Brian Romans and Lisa Streit when I was at Chevron, and then we continue to collaborate together. And we actually just published a paper on a channel system channelized architectural element that looks a lot like this, but you see an amalgamated sandy axis, and it transitions laterally to be more heterolithic and interbedded. And then here's a line drawing trace of that outcrop photograph. And each of these types of individual sediment gravity flow deposits stack one upon the other to form one of these architectural elements. And so in the next slide, what I'm going to show you is a laterally offset stack of these types of individual architectural elements from a famous outcrop of the Capistrano Formation at San Clemente State Beach, which shows south to north lateral stacking of individual channel elements. And it's going to be an animation, and it's going to be a lot to take in, but I have a little summary diagram at the end. So this is a orthophoto mosaic that Zoltan put together and interpreted as well. Each of the black lines represents bed boundaries. The red lines represent maybe more significant erosional surfaces that Zoltan has interpreted. Everything's kind of dipping to the left, which is to the north. You get some valleys where you miss out on things. Generally, things are kind of interbedded and heterolithic. Those are kind of more marginal deposits of these channelized architectural elements. And then they become a little bit thicker bedded and more amalgamated to the left. And you're seeing a bunch of these architectural elements stacked from right to left across the screen. This is a parking lot, so there's nothing there. And then this is one of the last of the channels in this stack of laterally offset right to left stacking channelized elements and you see a lot more amalgamated, relatively coarse-grained expression of facies. And we take oil and gas companies here to study the channel stacking patterns and talk about the processes by which they stack. And so that animation that I just showed you is, this is a line drawing trace that was published by the Shell group of the entire outcrop that I just showed you in that previous movie. And then this black dashed box region is these channel elements that are stacked at the far north or far left part of the outcrop belt. Pretty cool. So anyway, so each of these are like channel element margin boundaries that are preserved. And then this is the axis of the channel of the northernmost migrated or leftmost migrated channel element. So that's how, if you're lucky, you see channel elements stacking in outcrop. And that's one of the, I showed you a couple of outcrop examples, one from Chile and one from California, where you can actually see that stacking. It's not super common, but you can see it in places. This is what it looks like. So you saw all that detail in outcrop. This is what we see in seismic, right? So we get meandering channels here. You get a few high amplitude seismic reflections. So the whole channel system here is probably all these high amplitude seismic reflections that look like they're migrating left to right and then vertically stacking. For this one, you just get a few high amplitude seismic reflections. It wasn't active for very long. And then you get these wedge shaped seismic reflections, which are levee overbank deposits. This is what you see in seismic, right? So I'm going to show you some dip to down dip perspectives of how the stacking is changing. And we've already covered this, so I won't go through it in too much detail, but that's what you see. Just keep that in mind in the context of the outcrop that you just saw, right? So there's a lot more detail you can see in a few of these bends. And then this is that other channel system here. Again, a big influence on stacking patterns that we can see in seismic that would be hard to see because of the scale of it in outcrop is the fact that these mass transport complexes, these huge mass transport complexes are playing such a prominent role in the stacking patterns and planform evolution of these channels. And then these, when you get to the distal part of the data set, you get all these single or a couple seismic reflection blips that correspond with these weakly confined channels at the downstream reach of the system. Again, not a lot of detail in there, but you do see the overall trend of what's happening. So that's what the seismic's good for. We have some interesting insights in the planform evolution. We're going to zoom into this nice meandering channel. You can see that there's an initial line here. That's the initial channel center line. And then the last position is this really sinuous, this is what's on the seafloor, this really sinuous center line. And if you remember, so you can map those out, and if you remember what we talked about in the context of the Congo, the development of meandering of these sinuous channels depends on the age of the channel. Over time, they start off kind of, the initiate is relatively straight, and then over time, they slowly develop more and more sinuosity as they become more and more mature. And I think this illustrates this pretty good. This is an initial channel center line is straight. It's in blue and green here. And then the last active channel center line is in red. And we actually modeled that, like Zoltan's modeled that. And so this is a real simple model of the planform evolution of a channel that's based on that MeanderPy code that I mentioned before. And it's not we're not trying to replicate this exact same pattern, but I'll be darned if the flavor of this thing isn't the same as the flavor of what you can see in that example in New Zealand. Okay, so that was channel deposits. Let's look at lobe deposits, starting at the—
Excuse me, Jake.
Yes.
If you can wrap up, you know, like in 5 minutes or 3 minutes or so, will be great.
Okay. I'll go. I'll tell you what. I'll go until I'm done, and then if people want to log off, feel free to log off. But I'll be here to answer questions after.
Okay.
But I'll try to go faster. Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
So here's some lobe deposits that are in the Point Loma Formation of Southern California. Very sheet-like, very continuous, few hundred meters of beautiful outcrop exposure. We take sponsors here as well. So that's what you see at a bed scale. Heterogeneity again is affected by bed boundaries and the sedimentary structures within. A nice bridge between the outcrop and that conventional industry seismic, like we saw in New Zealand, is marine geophysical data sets, which tend to have shallow penetrating cores and really high frequency seismic reflection data. Here's a great example. One of the best papers about depositional lobe architecture and stacking patterns is by Mark Deptuk. So he looked at lobes that are forming on the Corsican margin. Here's a picture of one of those lobes. It's kind of a paddle-shaped feature, and it thins downstream. And they have cores so that they know what the lithology is as you move from upstream to downstream. These are a bunch of cross sections moving from upstream near the channel mouth to downstream near the distal fringe of the lobe. And then these are cores, and they also have age dates associated with them. There's been other people that have worked on this system. ExxonMobil, Mike Sweet, who's at USAG now, just published a cool paper in GSA Bulletin about it. Torsom. This is a really great example of a source to sink system from mountain belt all the way down to the canyon and lobe depositional systems. And what Deptuk produced this hierarchy of stacking of lobes from the bed to what he calls lobe elements, which are like bed sets, and then to lobes, like individual composite lobes that are fed by weakly confined channels, and then a stack of those forms a lobe complex. And it's all compensational, like the bed is deposited initially, and then subsequent beds feel the depositional topography of those pre-existing beds and stack, and then the larger scale body is also responding to the depositional topography, and the even larger scale body is responding. So in seismic, we do not see that kind of detail. This is what we see. We see these weakly confined channels, right? And weakly confined channels and these really large aspect ratio, high amplitude, sheet-like deposits. But that's pretty much it. So how does that compare to what we see in outcrop? So here is that same outcrop that I showed you to start off this quick discussion of lobe deposits from the Point Loma formation. And this is a line drawing interpretation of all the major like shales, I guess, that our student here at QCL, Cole Speed, could map. So really sheet-like. Looks like it continues forever, right? Well, let's put that in context of the seismic data. So this is only a few hundred meters of outcrop, and it's only like tens of meters thick or something like that. And so at the outcrop scale is this little guy compared to what we're seeing in the seismic. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying you need to keep this in mind when you're trying to interpret the lateral continuity of some of these sheet-like deposits, right? Okay, and then with respect to plan view evolution, I'm going to go through those avulsions, which I've numbered in order from the oldest to the youngest, one being the oldest channel pathway. And then you can't see these lobe or sheet-like deposits in the seismic. It's just they're too thin. But you can kind of see where the channels end. And so I've mapped in some little dashed lines that say, well, there's probably a lobe, like at the distal reach of this channel. So you can just see basically the plan view evolution is dominated by compensational stacking, where there's space available for deposition. That's where the next channel squeaks through, and that's how you stack up the depositional lobes at the distal reach of the channels. And that is important for heterogeneity when you stack up lobes in a compensational way. This is a model that Zoltan developed where the reds represent coarser grains and the blues represent finer grains. And basically the compensational stacking of individual lobes that have a facies transition from more coarse grained in the middle and fine grained at the margin results in creating like baffles at the very least between the sandier prone parts of the depositional lobe. So stacking compensationally from right to left, you're juxtaposing sandier deposits right on top of relatively fine-grained fringe-like deposits, and you see it both in the proximal part of these models and as well as in the distal parts. And we've done flow simulations of models like this, and it does make an impact to the pathways of fluid flow. All right, sorry, Lucy or Sahara, whomever had to interrupt me, but I'm done now. Okay, so but let me get to the summary and then questions. So this is what we went over. We talked about heterogeneity generally and what you see in the small scale and outcrop and what you see in the big scale. Please keep this in mind when you're interpreting seismic, and keep it in mind when you're interpreting outcrops. And then we explored this beautiful Taranaki basin. Maybe I got a little bit excited about this data set and showed a few too many images, but gosh darn it, it's just too, I just can't help myself, and I went over time. But this, I think it's a nice example to show the variation from upstream to downstream in a deep water system, and then also explore some of the impact of mass transport complex topography on channel evolution. But again, at a very broad sort of seismic scale. It's a nice introduction, I think, to depositional systems because you see everything right there. And then we focused on some of the sandier prone architectural elements and observations that you get from outcrops and how those architectural elements stack, and then how that relates to the seismic, to the entire system scale. So this, a nice summary, I think, of what the basic building blocks are is you get, and there's more to it than this, but like generally first order, if I'm talking to my kids about this stuff or somebody that's a non-geologist, I'm going to say there's weakly confined channels, there's these meandering slope channels, and then there's depositional lobes, and they organize themselves in predictable ways, right? We can figure out how they stack and how they evolve. Here's a couple of examples. The lobes stack compensationally, and that has a big impact on heterogeneity and fluid flow during hydrocarbon production, during CO2 injection, and then with respect to how channels evolve, we think that they change in a lateral sense, in a plan view sense, a lot like how channels do, but they just have more aggregation. So I'll leave it at that. And then there's just this pretty slick, oh, I don't know if it's slick, but I like it, an animation going upstream to downstream across the system, and just runs on a loop. So if there's any questions, I got time for questions. I got another meeting at 11 and that's it. Sorry to go over, y'all.
Hey, Jake, no worries. Yeah, please grab a cup of water before I answer questions. You talk like straight, like 60 minutes.
Okay.
But no, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for your very, very nice and amazing illustration and presentation. You'll be able to see those comments, in the chat. But so I'll go ahead in order for people who want to interact with you and ask you questions. So I think the first one will be from Mark Schuster. Mark, do you want to unmute yourself?
That was a great talk, Jake. Hey, I was curious, with the mass transport complexes, presumably there's some relief there. And is there any indication that you've got local effects in terms of gradient that could accelerate or decelerate flows? Is there crossing?
Like you're absolutely right. The blocks, I haven't seen blocks like, I mean, Lorena, I shouldn't say I haven't seen this. Lorena's like she's documented this stuff forever, but
I do consultancy, Jake, on this.
Very good, cool. That's what I'm trying to tempt you to collaborate more. So yeah, I mean, you saw the blocks, they're huge. And it almost certainly plays, just like I said, the gravity flows are dumb. They're just responding to changes in gradient. So it certainly plays a role. Unfortunately, even at this is pretty high frequency data. The peak frequency is 50 hertz. You can't really see much, man. That said, when I was doing a PhD, we worked on the Trace Passos formation I mentioned, but I worked with a guy named Dominic Armitage, who is one of our colleagues at Repsol. He's like one of their clastic experts now. He might be their clastic expert, actually, but he's a great turbidite sedimentologist, and he studied some of the scale that you're talking about on the top of mass transport complex topography, and there was like lots of beds, and they're changing related to the relief on top of the mass transport complex. So at the outcrop scale, you can see some of those effects for sure. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know if that answered your. It's more like I can't say for sure here, man.
Yeah, it kind of seemed. Also, I was curious if there's any control on, whether the channels straighten, if it's accelerating, with a higher gradient, or how that might impact the meandering as well.
Yeah. Again, that could play a role. But I just can't tell for sure. You saw that it definitely influenced. The path is weird when you go through those.
Oh yeah, it looked like it was reverse flow.
Yeah, there's that one that's upstream that I didn't focus on because the data aren't as good up there. But yeah, it just like you said, man, it comes all the way back on itself.
It's cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, so so Lorena has advertisements. You guys can see the link, and Sue Hiroka said such incredible images, and Cornell said thank you for the talk, Jake, wonderful visuals, and Tristan too. So Gillian has a question. Gillian, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, Jill has been tuned in to like all my stuff. I love it, and she always asks a really good question. That's good.
Well, I thought this time I'm not even going to try and write it.
But, yeah, I remember that.
To do that, it says online, it was awful. Jake, so it's related a little bit to Mark Schuster's question because, there's huge topography associated with mass transport complexes that effectively has to heal in some way before the turbidity current channel systems can become their readopt a normal behavior. So my question was to do with that healing. Do you think the straightness of the channels is because effectively they are kept in an immature phase by that unhealed topography, and that they can only develop the meandering topography when they've got a substrate that is related to deposition rather than the pseudo-structural topography of a mass transport complex? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't to briefly answer. Yes, absolutely. And I'm writing down some of your words because that was a nice way to put it. But yeah, no, I totally agree. The thing about it though, in some of these cases, like the mass transport complexes, in some cases like this one on the screen right now, you can see that it's like the channel's right in top of the mass transport complex. But in other cases, it's there's been quite a bit of deposition, like a lot of deposition over the top. But I think it's more draping, but it still maintains some of that topography. It heals it a bit, but then it's more of a draping. And so the subsequent channels still feel the, I think they still are responding to the gradient of the initial mass transport complex topography.
Oh, that is really interesting because
upstream you see that more. I thought like, I want to see this channel like in size this mass transport complex because it's stuck in it, but it didn't do that. So
that is fascinating, because we had a field in the Gulf of Mexico, Neptune, in the fold belt. It's quite an old field now, but 30% of that reservoir was mass transport complex. The rest was accommodating and trying to heal that, plus then a grading on top. And that business about the sinuosity, once it had started to aggrade, I thought you'd revert to a normal sinuosity, but you're saying you don't necessarily.
Oh, that's what I think generally happens, but it doesn't necessarily happen here. So, hey, by the way, Jill, you see some of the blocks in this thing? Do you see this thing?
Yeah.
Holy heck. The entire data set is just that. It's a huge mass transport complex, and there's a bunch of them.
I definitely want to get on that data.
Yeah, so one of Ian Kane's students wrote a paper about some of this stuff, some of the mass transport complexes. I don't remember if they wrote about the channels too much, but there's a paper out there that talks about it a little bit. But I looked at it and I didn't think that there was enough overlap with what I was talking about, so I didn't want to I mean, you saw I went over time, I couldn't cite everything, but you might check it out. But also it looks like there's kind of changes in the mass transport complex thickness. It's real, well, I don't know if it's real thick here, it's a little thinner, it's kind of thin, I don't know. Maybe it's thinner up here. Maybe there's something to that. But then right to the right, there's there's a big dog over here. But
there's so much to talk about with Lorena as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Hey, Jake. It's really great work, and I'm just trying to hold myself here, because it's really exciting.
Don't hold back.
So, but I think one of the things, especially with this slide that you're showing right now with the modeling component, many of the things that you're showing at this spectacular scale that gives you, control on the geometries and architectures, I think it's worth also calibrating with both outcrop analogs and subsurface examples. Gillian was mentioning one, but like in Thunderhurst, also there was some of that, and this stuff has been published, And then I think it was Algar in 2011, also in Borneo, was showing some of these relationships. But
cool.
This kind of situation in which the top topography of the MTDs controls reservoir distribution and geometries, it's very common and highly relevant when you're at the scale of field development to try to really understand flow units and things like that, and again, thinking in parallel here with the relevance for carbon sequestration. I mean, it's the reverse process, right? I mean, instead of extracting fluids, you're trying to inject fluids. So I guess understanding this is quite important on top of the sealing capacity or not of MTDs, because that internal heterogeneity that you're talking about, it's telling you a whole lot about internal structure.
For sure.
But anyways, I'll stop it there. But
I agree.
Really cool stuff.
Let's talk some more. I mean, these data were free. I mean, it took a long time to get them, but if you want to work, I mean, I know you have what you have to do right now, but we might chat a little bit more, have coffee or something. I love it.
Jay, add the Nile to those list of analogs. There's a whole bunch of fantastic ones there too.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, can you send me an email too? Just because I'm writing these, but then I might have missed some stuff. And you're not too shy usually about that, Jill. So you or Frank.
All right, let's move on to probably next question. So there are a couple of comments in between. I skipped that first. And so Nara has some question. Nara, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you. That was a great talk, Jake. So I guess my question is related to this process of the meandering formation. And I also had this question of how it was initiated, but you answered it. But I had a question related to the time scale. So because do you have I guess some numbers on the time scale this process develops, and also what would influence that time scale?
Yeah, so there's one well, I think, in this data set that we haven't incorporated yet, and it's far away, but we have all these regional horizons, so we can tie in the time. And I think that there's a micropaleo report, there usually is with these New Zealand data. So we could tie in the time, but I think it's kind of coarser than the scale at which meandering evolves. So I mean, we can get there, but I don't know how meaningful it is, like in the context of the evolution of individual bends and that kind of thing. But we should check. So, but about the what influences the time scale, I think it's, again, it's this idea of maturity. So like you can have a really active system that has the number of gravity flows moving through it is twice as much as another system, and I imagine it would develop sinuosity twice as fast. I mean, it's probably not linear like that, but it's something like that. It's almost like you'd want to know the frequency of gravity flow initiation in this environment in order to think about how many flows are moving through and how many flows it took to form a sinuous channel. Does that kind of make sense? You sounded like you wanted to follow up. Go ahead, Naira.
Yeah, well, no, I was, I guess, also asking for maybe the modeling. I guess, yeah, I understand it's difficult to tie those, you know, I guess the observations to date those things, but maybe in the modeling. But I guess, yeah. I understand.
There's a time that correlates, but you should talk to Zoltan about it, not me.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for the question and answer. Try not to skip those comments. Jad Johnson said, great talk, amazing imagery and research. Thank you, Jake. Linda McCall also said, great presentation, Jake. Thank you. And then we have a guest from Murphy Oil.
Oh, I know Stan. Stan, yeah. How's it going, man? Like, you got to answer my emails, man. Come on.
I'll be pinging you very, very soon, Jacob.
Oh, good. Thanks, man.
Yeah, and Scott Tinker also say thanks, Jake. One more question from Nan. Ooh, do you want to unmute yourself?
Oh my gosh, all this.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Hi, Jacob. I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, yep. We can hear you.
Oh, hi. Oh, thank you. The data set looks amazing. I just have a quick question. If you go back to your seismic section, yeah, just that one. Has the like the buried MTCs, not the seabed one.
Yeah.
So probably about, I'm not sure. Do you have a scale here? That 300 meters or 400 meters below the seabed. Is there any channels that trapped by the giant blocks?
Yeah.
On top of, I mean.
Yeah. So we haven't mapped all these
buried channels.
Yeah, we haven't mapped all these.
Yeah, sure.
At all.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, we haven't mapped. That's an awesome question, Nan. Like seriously, I look at this. I showed this stuff to Tim Watton, and he's like, you know, he's like a legendary geologist. That's on our team, a basin analyst, and really heavily involved in field and outcrop data, field work and outcrop data, and I don't know, he's looked at some seismic, but not too much. And I showed him some of these blocks, like the one that my cursor's on right now, and he's like blown away. Like that's one block that's entrained in a thing. Anyway, the point is we haven't mapped them yet. And I mean, if there's like if there's some kind of terrigenous sediment supply that's making its way into this basin, and there's a block that's like 100 milliseconds poking like above the seabed, it's got to have an influence on the channel. So that's a hypothesis that we can test with more mapping.
Yeah, it looks like inside you.
Sorry?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is
that giant blocks, it looks like.
I mentioned to Jill that there's this paper by Ian Kane, one of Ian Kane's students, that looked at this data set already. And I'm going to find it for you, just people that are, I don't want to leave you all in suspense, but and then you can check it out too, because they might have mapped the lower section more. Here you go. I'm gonna put it in the chat.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. course. And I didn't cite it just because I didn't have, you saw I went over like bad boy, but here's that. There's a link if anybody that wants it. There's only like a few of you all left, so it's like the diehards are left. So let me see. Let me send you the citation as well. There's a number of them actually. Let me go. I just searched on Google Scholar. Mega class within mass transport deposits. That sounds kind of good. Let me help you. Copy. This was just published. Let me see. Anyway, I should stop searching. You guys can Google. You know how to use Google, guys. So anyway.
Okay, so I'll leave. So I think Frank has a question about huge blocks in the MTC in the Neptune field. Frank?
Oh, cool. He says that they're so big. Yeah, man, yeah. I know. I'm reading your question, dude. Yeah.
Yeah.
Insane,
right? The field there, both Jill and I worked on it. It's the main reservoirs are developed on top of huge mass transport complexes, and the blocks in there are so big that and they slid down without. So that the beds that were near horizontal remained horizontal. So when they were drilled into, it was really hard to convince people that actually this stuff that looked like normal stratigraphy had actually come 2/3 of the way down the continental slope. And the blocks were literally miles across. And the key there was that the biostratigraphy within them told us that they were upper slope and they were sitting out in the lower slope. But they certainly did have a huge effect on the channel distribution immediately on top of them. It was the key to understanding the distribution of the reservoir that was on top of them, was to understand where those mega blocks were.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
We could talk more. It's cool.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Yeah, I mean, of course, anytime you want to chat, man. And I loved your, I'm glad you did that said online talk, because I liked your talk at BEG, but I had to leave halfway through. So I got to watch, now I can watch it forever, right?
Okay.
Good job.
And we should talk about that too.
Yeah, I looked at the bottom in that survey that I couldn't show, but that we're working, we're focused on just the thin veneer on the top. And I looked at the base salt, and it's hard to pick, but you can, I mean, you obviously picked it, so you can do it, but
yeah, it is. Cool. Yeah, there's places where you track it, but there's a lot more where you literally have to go in on a line by line by line basis, because that topography there is going up and down. It's mountainous. It's literally mountainous, and nothing will track it.
Yeah. Now we're just having a conversation, and we're not really talking about the topic.
No,
I'll shut up.
Now we're like just having coffee. Maybe we should have a coffee. Like.
Anytime, Jake. Anytime.
Great. Are you guys coming out on the summer?
Yeah, September.
Okay.
So we're not out before September. It looks like. I mean, I say that, but things change.
Okay. Well, I'll be back in August. So.
Yeah, just want to show you, because this is how. Don't know if you can see, we just had our inoculation.
Congratulations.
That's how we were brave when we got the inoculation. So that means we can come over eventually. But
cool.
Okay. Not to let other people.
I'll get off the line.
All right. Hey, bye. Yeah. See you.
All right. So any more last minute question? I didn't see any right now, but I guess you all have, how to reach out to Jake. So if you have any follow-up question after this, please feel free to reach out and discuss it with Jake. And Jake, thank you so much for this great presentation this morning, and stay longer for all the questions. Thank you so much.
Yep, no worries. See you all later. Bye.